Hello, and welcome to our first presentation about the signs of the times. I think you'll find this quite fascinating, and some may even find it quite challenging. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at what's going on around the world, and then we are going to be comparing this to Bible prophecy. Before we actually begin with what's happening in the world, I want to go back in time to the time of Jesus Christ. And he said to the people in his day, "Ye can discern the face of the sky, but can ye not discern the signs of the times?" In other words, the people should have been aware of what was going on in their time. And I can't help but think that perhaps we have the same sort of situation today, where people should be aware when in actual fact they are not. So what I want to look at is the signs of the times sermon or speech that Jesus gave to his disciples just before his death and resurrection. It's called the Olivet Discourse because it was given on the Mount of Olives. Now, just before Jesus left the temple for the very last time, he said to the religious leaders of his day, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." Now, this was of great concern to the disciples, who obviously heard what Jesus said, and they were concerned because their hopes were tied up with the temple. They wanted to see the temple become the capital of the new state of Israel, which would reign over the earth. The Romans would be finished, and they were fighting amongst themselves to see who was going to be the prime minister and who was going to be the treasurer of this new kingdom. So they came obviously to Jesus and said, "Look, isn't this a wonderful temple? Isn't this beautiful? Look at these stones. Aren't they huge? How could they possibly be destroyed?" So Jesus says to them, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now that gave the disciples something to contemplate as they walked to their destination, which was the Mount of Olives. And they must have been thinking in their minds, surely Jesus is talking about the time of the end or the great apocalypse at the end of time, because they couldn't believe that their precious temple could be destroyed before the end of time. So they come to Jesus on the top of Mount Olivet and they say to him, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" You see, they've associated the destruction of the temple with the end of the world. So Jesus says to them, the very first thing, he answered and said unto them, "Take heed that no man deceive you." In other words, Jesus is saying that there's going to be a lot of deception about these things that I'm about to disclose to you, and about the time of the end and the temple. "For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." And then he also said, "There shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." Now that sounds like a great deception, and it's going to be so great that maybe even God's elect are in danger of believing it. Now this deception obviously has to have something to do with religion, because this is establishing the Christian religion, and the deception obviously has to have something to do with the Christian religion. Now, as Jesus finished the discourse on the Olivet Mountain, he finished it by saying, "Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord has made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season?" Now, Jesus is obviously not talking about literal food here. He's talking about who's going to give my people the right food at the right time. Who's going to give my people the right information at the right time about all these things that I've just been speaking to you about? So, what we can get out of this statement from Jesus is a principle. And the principle is present truth. The principle of present truth. Now, the best way to explain this is to provide you with some examples. Here's an example. What was present truth in the time of Noah? Now, that was pretty simple. It was get in the ark. Now, that truth at that time applied only to that generation. It doesn't apply to us today, but it was certainly applicable to the people who lived in the time of Noah. If they wanted to be saved, they had to get in the ark. You see, that was the truth that applied to the people at that time. Now, what was the present truth in the time of Moses? Well, again, it was quite simple. If you want to be saved, get out of Egypt. We're heading for the promised land, and if you want to be included in the salvation available to God's people, it was time to leave Egypt and go to the promised land. What was present truth in the time of Christ? Jesus came into Galilee preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent ye and believe the gospel. Now, what is interesting about this is Jesus says the time is fulfilled. In other words, the time has arrived for this message to be given. So you see, there was a time when this message is applicable. And that is a principle which applies basically to every generation. Every generation has a truth which they have to respond to. Peter wrote to the Christian people, and be established in the present truth. Now, that obviously means that the people of Peter's generation had to apply themselves to the truth about Christ. The question I have is such a principle applicable to us today? It certainly is. But first I want to ask, how many people went into the ark? Now, I'm sure you all know the answer to this question. There were 8, wasn't there? Out of that generation, only 8 people went into the ark. Now, that tells us something interesting about present truth. And that is that present truth is never popular. How many people went into the promised land of that generation? Only 2. Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses himself never went in. That generation that left Egypt, they all perished in the desert. And the reason why they perished in the desert was they were not able to accept present truth. How many people entered into the kingdom at the close of Christ's ministry? Actually, only 1. Most of his disciples fled and deserted him. Only 1 made a public commitment to join Christ's kingdom. So you see, what I'm trying to explain here is that present truth is never popular, it's always resisted, and it's always ridiculed. The apostles preached truth at Pentecost. Look what they said and how the people reacted. Now when they heard this, they were pricked in their heart and said unto Peter and to the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? Now here you have a good key to understanding why present truth is resisted. It is because when present truth is presented, it requires the people to do something, to act. And this is why people resist present truth. It's because they don't want to do something. They are quite happy to remain in the condition that they are, and they don't want to change. You know, regardless of whether you're a communist, a socialist, or even a national right-winger, everybody is naturally conservative in their own personal behavior. Nobody likes change. And so this is what present truth requires, though, from people. It requires change. And change is not comfortable to most people. So that's why it's resisted. Now, there is another concept to present truth. God has placed watchmen on the walls of Zion. And what is the purpose of a watchman? His purpose is to cry out when he sees danger. I have set watchmen upon the walls, O Jerusalem, which shall never hold their peace day nor night. In other words, they're supposed to be blowing their trumpets about the signs of the times. They're supposed to be warning the people and telling them what's going on and how this relates to present truth in their time. This is the purpose of the watchman. But unfortunately, the watchmen are letting down the people. They were letting down the people even in the time of the Old Testament. His watchmen are blind. They are all ignorant, and they are like dumb dogs. They cannot bark, sleeping, lying down, loving to slumber. You know, if you wanted to have a watchdog to protect your interests, to protect your property, to protect your family, and he wouldn't bark when danger came, what would you do with the dog? He wouldn't be around for much, would he? You'd get yourself another dog. But that's what the watchmen are supposed to do. They're supposed to bark like dogs when they see danger. Do you hear much barking in your church? Do you hear much trumpets blowing? Do you hear that kind of thing in your church today? I have a feeling probably not. The dogs are sleeping and the watchmen have joined them. So what is the present truth about God's church today? You know, there are many things that we could talk about on this particular topic, but I just want to focus on one thing. I want to focus on the parable of the 10 virgins, because this is the condition of God's people today. Then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins, which took their lamps and went forth to meet the bridegroom. And 5 of them were wise, and 5 of them were foolish. They that were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them, but the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. Now, the interesting thing about this parable is this little word then. Then is a conjunctive. It joins together 2 ideas or 2 narratives. And this parable that Jesus tells comes right at the end of his Olivet Discourse, where he talks about the signs of the times which are coming upon the world. And he says, then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins. So, in other words, he's talking about the time of the end. When we come down to the time of the end of the world, the church is going to be like 10 virgins. 5 are foolish and 5 are wise. Now that means that 5 who were foolish went to sleep, right? And the 5 that were wise stayed awake. But no, that's not actually what the parable says. That's not what Jesus is telling us. All 10 virgins went to sleep. Now, just catch on to this. This is the church at Christ's coming. This is the church at the end of time. All the members of the church went to sleep. So how can the church discern the signs of the times if they're asleep? How can the church listen to the dogs that bark or the trumpets that's supposed to blow when they're asleep? This is the condition of the church. So I'm just trying to explain why it's going to be difficult for some people watching this program to accept what the signs of the times are telling. And the reason is because we're asleep. You've heard that knowledge is power, haven't you? This is the catch cry of the modern technological age, where so much knowledge is available, and if those who are in possession of knowledge, they are actually able to exploit situations and things in a way that others can't. knowledge is power. Well, again, God's people are a little deficient in this area. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Knowledge is very important. Look what Lincoln says, Abraham Lincoln. I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts. Another one from James Madison. He was also a president of the United States. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. Let me try and explain why knowledge and truth is vitally important. If we live in a democratic country, we are all required to make choices. That's part of the governance of such a society. But how can people make the right choices unless they have the right information, unless they have the right knowledge? Now, some of us also belong to a kingdom called the kingdom of Christ, or the kingdom of heaven. Now, in this kingdom, how can we also make the right decisions if we don't have the right information? So this is why truth and knowledge is vitally important. So what I'm proposing to do here is to give us some truth and knowledge, and what you do with it, that's up to you. But I'm going to present you some facts. Some of these facts are going to be disturbing. Some of them are going to be hard to accept for some people. But nevertheless, I do believe they are true, and I do believe that they will have a severe impact upon this planet and upon everybody on it. So this is the purpose of these programs, to present the signs of the times, and we're going to be looking at how this applies to Bible prophecy. So here we have come. Here we've come to the signs of the times, June 2015. This day of recording is actually the last day of June, the 30th of June. And what I would like to give you is some of the up-to-date things that are happening in the world today. World War III is likely to be coming sooner rather than later. And why do I say that? Because many world leaders are saying exactly the same thing. The Pope, for example, says World War III is coming piecemeal. What does he mean by that? He means it's coming step by step. It's getting more and more severe. The reasons and causes for it are becoming greater. Vladimir Putin, he gave a very important speech at a conference, and the name of the conference was called The World Order, New Rules or a Game Without Rules. In this he says, today Russia sees the outbreak of global war as almost inevitable. Here is Baron Lord Jacob Rothschild. Now, he's the kind of person who would know what's happening around the world. He's a kind of like an insider's insider. And he has warned the investors in his companies that the world is mired in the most dangerous geopolitical situation since World War II. And he is telling his shareholders that the focus of his company is going to be on protecting wealth rather than increasing it. Now that tells you something. That tells you that he's going to be withdrawing from the markets. He's going to be trying to preserve what he has rather than losing it, because that's what he's expecting to happen. Here is an article from a Russian newspaper, Pravda, and they're reporting on what China thinks. China says war is inevitable with the US. The nationalist Global Times, a paper owned by the ruling Communist Party's official newspaper, the People's Daily, said in a Monday editorial that war would be inevitable between China and the United States unless Washington stopped demanding Beijing halt the building of artificial islands in the disputed waterway. Here's another one. WikiLeaks reveals NATO attack plan against Russia. And it says one of the telegrams are signed by the head of the State Department, Hillary Clinton. The plan is secret, emphasized Clinton to the astute US diplomats at NATO. So apparently NATO has a secret plan about how they're going to attack Russia. I'm sure, well, some of you may have heard of a man called George Soros. He's one of the big players in the world. He's a mover and shaker. You can see from these articles on these magazines that he's often in the headlines. He's often a person they call in on TV channels in America to give his view on all sorts of things. This is what he says. He says, unless the US makes major concessions and allows China's currency to join the IMF's basket of currencies, there is a real danger China will align itself with Russia politically and militarily, and then the threat of world war becomes real. Well, Mr. Soros, I have to tell you that China and Russia are aligning themselves together very, very rapidly, and they are doing it because they are trying to protect themselves. So this is the doomsday clock, which scientists around the world have put together, and they just recently moved it to 3 minutes to midnight. It used to be 4 minutes to midnight. And the reason they did that in January of this year, and the reason they've done that is because they too think that we are getting very close to World War III. Now, something of interest for New Zealand. For the first time, a New Zealand Prime Minister, John Key, was invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, which took place in January of this year. Now, why would a New Zealand MP a Prime Minister get invited to such a prestigious conference where basically only billionaires and corporate CEOs, etc., meet? Well, it's quite an interesting little meeting, this one. It costs $40,000 US a ticket, and at this one, there was 1,700 private jets flew in to attend. The Swiss military had to open up some of their Air Force bases in order to accommodate all these planes. But here is a man who's one of the movers and shakers. You probably never heard of him, but he's a very well-known head of a hedge fund, which is kind of like a glorified banker. His name is Robert Johnson. And he was reported as saying he made headlines when he divulged that hedge fund managers all over the world are buying airstrips and farms in places like New Zealand because they think they need a getaway. Now we know why John Key was invited. It was, hey John, nudge nudge, what can you do for us? We need a place to hide. And I thought it was interesting that Robert Johnson, he never mentioned any other country as a place of refuge than New Zealand. So lucky New Zealand. And I think that we're going to have quite a few visitors in the near future. And sure enough, the Guardian newspaper contacted leading real estate companies in New Zealand and asked them, are wealthy people coming to live in New Zealand? And the realtors in New Zealand subsequently confirmed the flight to safety by the elite, noting that paranoia and concerns about personal safety and global crisis were driving the trend. You'll notice that our friend Robert Johnson used the word panic in his description of these people. People with wealth, people with things that they treasure and don't want to lose are rapidly trying to find places of safety because they see the writing on the wall, so to speak. So why are world leaders thinking that World War III is imminent? Let's explore this one. To understand this, we need to go to this part of the world called the Middle East. And I'm sure you know that there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of crisis, a lot of war going on in the Middle East. And we're going to be looking at 7 major agendas which are taking place around the world, but focused mostly on this part of the world. They are all interrelated and intertwined. The first agenda that we're going to look at is the imperial agenda. Now, the word imperial implies an empire. An imperialist power is an empire power. So we have to ask the question, who is the empire? Now, that's a question that I'll let you mull over for a minute, because generally most people do not see an empire in the world today. But some people do, and this is it. It's the American empire. When people think of America, we don't think of it as an empire, but it really truly is. And I'd like to prove this to you. You can see here that these are all authors that are writing about America as an empire. And I'll show you a few more. These are authors who are saying that the empire is almost over. In other words, the empire has come and gone. Not quite gone yet. I like the one down in the corner down there that says, "Bye-bye, Miss American Pie." No, Miss American Empire. And you see that these people are of the opinion that the empire is in decline and it will eventually go into fade. It's just like the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire took many, many years to fall. It went into crisis after crisis and eventually fell. And this is what these people are pointing out. One crisis too many, and the American empire will also fall. So, is America an empire? Well, this is the New York Times building, and they published a magazine. And back in 2003, they published this magazine. It's the headline on the magazine was "American Empire. Get used to it." That was the subtitle. So the Americans themselves are beginning to realize that they are living in an empire. This is a man called Karl Rove. He is a spin doctor, and he worked for George Bush. And a spin doctor today is what they used to call the Ministry of Propaganda. And so that's his job. His job is to spin the news so that people can accept what's going on. So a journalist met this man, and this is what the journalist heard from him. He talks to the journalist. He says, "Guys like me," he's talking to the journalist, "were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore," he continued. "We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors. And you, all of you," he means all the journalists, "will be left to just study what we do." So there you have it. He's an empire builder. And this is what America has become. Today, America is no mere superpower or hegemon, but a full-blown empire in the Roman and British sense. No country has been as dominant culturally, economically, technologically, and militarily in the history of the world since the Roman Empire. Now, we have in this statement an interesting word, hegemon. That's a word that many people are not familiar with, but when we're talking about empires, it's a word that crops up often. What is hegemon or hegemony? The position of being the strongest and most powerful and therefore able to control others. And that is exactly what America is today. This is American hegemony, and it's the world turned red, white, and blue. And that's what America is trying to do. Whether we recognize it or not, it's definitely one of the signs of the times. This is the American agenda. This is the imperial agenda. This man, Paul Wolfowitz, who used to be the president of the World Bank, and he's held different positions around. He was also the US Secretary of Defense, and he's kind of like the philosophical foundation of the imperial agenda. Our first objective is to prevent the re-emergence of a new rival. He's talking about the demise of the USSR back in 1991, and the objective of the imperial policy of America is to prevent the re-emergence of such a rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order of that posed formerly by the Soviet Union. So this is the official policy of the American government, to stop any other country in the world rising to a position where it can challenge it. And now you may have a little insight into why things are happening the way they are around the world. They have a policy called full spectrum dominance. Now, what that means is America's policy is to control absolutely everything. They want to control the earth, they want to control the air, they want to control the water, they want to control space, they want to control technology, they want to control finance, they want full spectrum dominance. It means everything. They want to control everything. And that gives you a little picture, a little indication of what full spectrum dominance means. The control of everything. And it's being done through the Pentagon, which is, as you know, the American Defense Department. Now, this has been going on for some time. This is a book called America's Deadliest Export, Democracy. A strange title perhaps, but not to those who are on the receiving end of it. This is what he says in this book. Since the end of the Second World War, the United States of America has attempted to overthrow more than 50 governments, most of which were democratically elected, attempted to suppress a populist or nationalist movement in 20 countries, grossly interfered in democratic elections in at least 30 countries, dropped bombs on the people of more than 30 countries, attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. Now, some of you may find this hard to believe, but I will show you some details as we go through these programs. And by the way, there's 10 of them. This is the first one. As we go through these, I'll show you some more details about how this has taken place and how the Americans even know it and accept it and admit it. Now, an empire needs control of its territory. So America has compartmentalized the whole world into different military commands. Now, only an empire needs military commands over the whole world. There's no doubt that America is an empire. So you can see that us in New Zealand, we're part of US Pacific Command. And every part of the world has a American military command over it. They also have the most effective and intrusive information gathering services of the planet. This is simply a description of the Five Eyes system. This is not even NASA, which has been in the news recently for spying on everybody. It says, no business nowhere is too small or too remote not to be of interest to the empire. From its military bases all over the globe and its sensors orbiting the planet, the American Imperium watched everyone, everywhere, all the time. No sparrow falls anywhere in the world without triggering a monitoring device in the Pentagon. Remember, information is what? Power. That's why they collect it, so that they can have power over us. And we in New Zealand are part of it. This is part of what they call the Five Eyes. We're one of the Five Eyes. And I'm sure most New Zealanders are aware of these installations here in the Waihope Valley of Marlborough, New Zealand. So we are actually part of the American Imperium. Now, the 2013 base structure report from the Pentagon tells us that the military of the United States is deployed in more than 150 countries around the world, with over 160,000 of its active duty personnel serving outside the United States and its territories, and an additional 120,000 deployed in various contingency operations. Now, only an empire needs this kind of deployment of its military. There are 576 bases in foreign countries, and makes a total of 4,855. America's business is the military. That's just one of their bases. That's on San Diego Garcia, which is in kind of like in the middle of the Indian Ocean. That's one of the more beautiful bases they have. All the indigenous people were shipped off that island, or that atoll, whatever you like to call it, so that they could make room for the US military. There's another one. When Kosovo became an independent country, you have this base called Bondsteel. America has bases everywhere. This is Iran, which I'm sure you know is not particularly flavor of the month with America. And you'll notice that it is totally surrounded by American military bases. This is what America does. Anybody who gets offside with America will be subject to what they call containment. And this is the containment of Iran. You can see that if you were an Iranian, you would probably be a little concerned about who's right on your border. Now, this empire is a little different from most empires. It's an empire of debt. And as we go through these programs, we will explore this concept of the empire of debt a little more fully. One nation under stress in debt. IOU-SA. Okay, I think possibly that's enough evidence to suggest that America is an empire. I want to go to Agenda 2 now, which I call the Bretton Woods and the Petro Dollar. And this is called Bretton Woods because it took place at a place called Bretton Woods. Here is a sign. It says, this site was chosen in July 1944 as the location of one of the most important meetings of the 20th century, convened by the Allied nations before the end of World War II and attended by representatives of 44 countries. The Bretton Woods Conference established regulations for the international monetary system following the war. The conference created the International Monetary Fund and the future World Bank and linked the exchange rate of world currencies to the value of gold. Now that last statement is the most interesting. Linked the exchange of world currencies to the value of gold. Are world currencies linked to the value of gold at the moment? No, they are not. And there is a reason for that. And that's also one of the reasons why we live in financial chaos. They're very proud of this meeting in Bretton Woods. In this room, the Articles of Agreement setting up the International Monetary Fund were signed in July 1944. Now, I'm going to have to try and explain to you what this Bretton Woods agreement was about, because this is vital to understand the signs of the times. Now, you'll see here that this is a big dollar, a pool of dollars here. Now, every other currency is linked to the dollar. There's the yen, there's the British pound, there's the French franc, And there's the Deutschmark. And then other currencies are linked to the pound, to the French franc, and to the Deutschmark. So all of these currencies here, all these ones around the dollar, they all derive their value from the American dollar. That's why they're linked to the American dollar. So what is it that keeps the value of the American dollar? It's gold. Now, I want to try and explain this again. All of these currencies, these ones here, they derive their value from the dollar. This is the Bretton Woods agreement. This is not how it is today. They get their value from the dollar, and the dollar gets its value from gold. So gold is the fundamental backstop, if you like, for the financial health of the world, and all the other currencies are linked to the dollar. That was how the system was to work. So, in other words, America had to keep a lot of gold. And I'm sure you've heard of Fort Knox. That's supposedly where all the gold was kept. But the problem was, these countries who were linked to the American dollar, they could at any time ask the US government for gold for dollars. In other words, if they felt that they had too many dollars, excessive dollars, they could go to the American government and say, we want to exchange them for gold. And that's how the Bretton Woods system operated, and it provided financial stability from 1944 to 1971. What happened in 1971? Well, 1971 was the time of the Vietnam War, and wars are expensive. And what happened was America started printing heaps and heaps of dollars to pay for the war. And these dollars were going out into the world, and they were being accumulated by countries such as France. And France got a little bit twitchy and said, we have too many American dollars. And they wanted to exchange them. But the problem was America didn't have enough gold. So what happened was, when the French asked for their gold back, Richard Nixon, who was the president at the time, he went on national TV and he said to the American people, I'm closing the gold window, which is kind of like spin. Spin, yeah, that's what it was, spin. He was concealing the real issue. But he did say to the American people, it's time to tighten our belts. Here is a newspaper being read by some American tourists in London. Tighten your belts, Nixon tells America. So you see, this is actually a momentous occasion. And when the history books are written, if the world goes on so long, for 100 years, they may look back upon this time as being one of the most decisive times in the history of the 20th century, which is affecting us still today in the 21st century. It's because of what happened in 1971 that we live in financial turmoil today. In 1971, America refused to pay its debts in gold. Now, normally, we would call that bankruptcy. When people can't pay their debts, what happens? If you can't pay your debts, what happens to you? You normally are made bankrupt. This is a comment from a scholar. When in 1970-71, foreigners demanded payment for their dollars in gold, the US government defaulted on its payments on August 15, 1971. While the popular spin, he's got that word there, that's what it was. While the popular spin told the story of severing the link between the dollar and gold, in reality the denial to pay back in gold was an act of bankruptcy by the US government. And it was. So why did the nations of the earth put up with it? Well, it's because they needed America, because you've got to remember, back in 1971, this was the height of the Cold War. And America was the guarantee for everybody's security. So people swallowed hard and accepted it. But now what happens is all the currencies start floating against each other. And they're going up and down, and this is a very disturbing time for the financial markets of the world. Now, even though the American dollar was kind of saved by America refusing to pay out in gold, nevertheless, people started being very afraid of the American dollar, and they wanted to get rid of their dollars, and so the American dollar started falling in value. And of course, this was a major concern for an empire, because if their currency turns to rubbish, like this, for example, then their empire is basically over. So America had to do something to save the dollar. And that is going to be the subject of our next presentation. What did America do to save the dollar? Because this has a huge impact on how we live today and the signs of the times that we live under. Now, I know that some people can get a little twitchy themselves when these kind of subjects are brought up, and some people may even be afraid. But I want to confirm that in spite of everything that goes on in the world, God is in control. He says that He is holding back the four winds, not allowing them to blow upon the earth, which means that He's holding back the forces of destruction. That the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor any tree. So God is restraining the forces of destruction. But this is good news, but we also need to know that there is a limit to what God is willing to put up with. This restraining of the world's forces of evil or destruction, or whatever you like to call them, is only going to go on till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. So I would like to encourage each and every one of you who watches these programs to be one of those servants who has his forehead sealed. Now, we're not going to go into what that actually means. Maybe you can take that on board for homework. Research that. What does it mean to have your forehead sealed? Or have the seal of God placed in there? By the way, I want you to notice it says not on the forehead, but in the forehead.